So part two, Habermas and Modernity's project. So let me briefly come to Habermas. So if Gandhi is highly critical, Habermas is an apologist for the project of modernity in the fashion of Frankfurt School, argues rather that every attempt should be made to preserve the emancipatory impulse behind the Enlightenment. Okay, so he's more or less an apologist for the Enlightenment. Modernization in the post-industrial society might well take a different direction, but its praxis should not be based on performativity or the idleness of pure aesthetics, the Dionysian force of the political. The failure of modernity, if indeed failure at all, for Habermas is rooted in the splintering off of totality of life or unity of experience into pluralization of diverging universe of discourse that has shattered the naive consensus. And consensual knowledge is what science is based on, as is the programmatic for communicative rationality that sets aside absolutes and totalizing theories, including that of Western logocentrism. This is the rational basis of action. Still, Habermas is critical of performativity. The plotted efficiency criterion, which inculcates training for the sake merely of technical productive ends. Even this consensual premise, particularly for the educational dimensions of science, takes second seat to what's called paralogism, the search for instabilities and undermining of what is taken to be normal science, particularly in the age of high technology and in the background of the critique of all ideology. The iron cage caricature of rationality that Marx and Weber painted is just too narrow and overdetermined in the context of class politics, of bureaucratic and technocratic rationalism, while the normative and the affective areas of thought are effaced from the more value and interest nuanced presuppositions of rationality. There has been an unmitigated bifurcation of reason into the instrumental positivistic and moral political form. The twain seem never to meet in a unitary praxis of the total development of the individual. Hence, this critique of the positivistic and empirical know-all self-assuredness of science and paradoxically the technological means and form of practice, properly speaking, instrumentalist mentality of late Western capitalism. So education or pedagogy in the modern times has become something of a captive to these roots of technocratic rationality. These are two significant signs of moderation in Habermas's otherwise more universalistic and quasi-Kantian ecohumanism, and which indeed Leotard himself finds to be in some agreement as he develops his own critique of the différent. But the agreement between the two theories does not run the deep. In fact, it barely crosses the Rhine being the river near Habermas's institution, especially since Habermas has already preempted his criticism of Lyotard by including all French post-structuralists and philosophers, the young conservatives, as he calls them. He deems them to have fallen under the relativist snare of postmodernism, for which he singles out Foucault as the gang leader, followed by Derrida, Deleuze. By 1984, he targets his critique of more poignantly at Lyotard himself. So the question for Habermas that Lyotard also poses is the how of this unitary praxis. On the one hand, Habermas seems committed to the value orientation of education, while on the other hand, the preferred means for this realization of values need to be so compellingly bereft of the efficiency and economy of the procedures normatively formulated in the technical spheres. He means particularly science, provided they do not form part of the definition of rationality, which technological rationality indeed takes it to be so, but mistakenly. And Habermas agrees with that. The preferred operational vivendi is for a dialectical relation between values and techniques for their satisfaction. He invokes Dewey for having had this insight into the interconnectedness of values with technical knowledge, techniques that are multiplied and improved while the values subject themselves, quote, indirectly to a pragmatic test of their validity, end quote. In a more general way, Gandhi had not ruled out the role of technical knowledge, particularly in respect of the vocational orientation, the hand ever in action that he articulated in his basic education schema. For the spinning wheel. I mean, the charka is a technology, or the loom, the hand, the loom on which people are working, weaving clothes and so forth, or the cast in which the dye is thrown and the clothes are colored. These are forms of technology, or where the concrete is being mixed. Gandhi does not deny that. However, 2 points of contrast stand out. Gandhi did not, as Habermas is, bent upon encompassing the dialectical stratagem under the transcendentalism of reason. So that's really perhaps more the critique, which is, of course, a Heideggerian critique also, that you can go with technology, but keep reason out of trying to meddle with it and take control of that, because then technology becomes a handmaid of reason, and reason with its own ends may go anywhere. Totalitarianism, as Hannah Arendt points out, would be one consequence of that. So the values in the end outweigh the means, the pragmatism, to be sure, of technical knowledge, which Habermas would fain have us believe can be seen on a par, say, with Aristotle's idea of intellectual wisdom as an end in itself. In that regard, Tagore's criticism of Gandhi rubs off on Habermas as well. The birds do spend their whole day foraging for food. They tweet, sing melodies, fly in joy, and play with their own kind. I think it means they do not spend their whole day foraging for food. They tweet, sing melodies, fly in joy, play with their own kind. So they're not working all the time. There's little evidence in Habermas that despite his concerns for the role of values in the modes of knowledge making in its transmission process, in more concrete terms, they scarcely echo a gradual march towards the rich legacy of European aesthetics, of play, of leisure, let alone the excelsis of the Gandhian sublime, the spirit. The Kantian sublime, which could be the Gandhian sublime as well, the spirit, that which is the object of thought, but not something that we can reach. It's the transcendental, that of which we cannot know the thing in itself. Gandhi is not faultless here either, but his technical pedagogy and the political encompass the spiritual and the aesthetic like some light sense as well. So Gandhi, cannot be left without fault. His technical pedagogy and the political also encompass the spiritual and the aesthetics, but in a much lighter sense than perhaps in Tagore, which is very strong and very heavy. Also because Tagore came from the Baul tradition, the Vaishnava tradition. He was a very strong believer, in a sense, in Devata, in Ishvara, than Gandhi was, which is why Gandhiji called him Gurudev. Whereas Gandhi was just a Mahatma, Atman in what sense, we don't exactly know, but it's certainly not Deva. So part 3, Leotard and the postmodern conditioning. This is a rather short part. Leotard, in contrast to both, but especially Habermas, is deeply suspicious of the promises of the Enlightenment, even the so-called radical Enlightenment, which is a legacy of the 17th, 18th century Italian Renaissance and German neo-idealism that Habermas believes is still simply incomplete and not deficient as a universal project as such. So if you see the sense of it, postmodernists say that Enlightenment was deficient. It should be done away with, or should be totally overhauled, or turned over. Savolta chiasco, savolta, people say that. Whereas Habermas saying it was just not complete, it hasn't reached its end, it hasn't reached the goal that it set up. So we can push the boundary a little further. See, that's the difference. So to Leotard, the project of modernity has not been forsaken or forgotten, but destroyed, liquidated. That's what he means by that. And this destruction is nowhere more marked than the symbol of the Auschwitz, where the Jews were incarcerated and burnt alive virtually, or killed with gas, and then incarcerated, incinerated rather is the term. One doesn't know whether they were dead or living because there are no certificates being produced for their death. So it's marked in the symbol of the Auschwitz, and they quote him, victory of the capitalist technoscience over the other candidates for the universal finality of human history, end quote. For neither have succeeded in completing the project, but rather capitulated it by dint of its own inherent contradictions. So what it's basically saying is that modernity has had these two effects. On the one side, endless wars, Auschwitz, Holocaust, and so on. And then next, the rise of what we today call corporate capitalism, capitalist technoculture, and so forth, by which it's now coming to dominate the whole world. Nuclear power, climate change, the impact of the climate on the environment, erosion of rights of women, minorities, of third world people, and so on. And you see this happening, in the case of the response to the pandemic as well. Who gets the vaccinations first? Who gets the vaccination last? Who does not get a vaccination at all? There's politics involved at every stage, and that's what Lyotard means by the way in which capitalism, since the Enlightenment, has been able to liquidate, and then there are inherent contradictions and so forth. But instead of resolving the contradictions, it produces consequences which then have deleterious effects on people, on our world. Okay, so it is facts, the subject's mastery over objects, that contemporary science and technology generate, that brings not greater freedom, more public education, or greater wealth, more evenly distributed. Rather, it brings an increased reliance on facts, on objects, on scientific facts as well, on data, on crunching, on numbers, and so on. So, the US could have decided that there is the vaccines. We won't rush to vaccinate all of America, we rush to vaccinate all of the globe. Now they're saying that they will do that. But the variants have come about and the vaccines are not as powerful. So if India had been vaccinated much earlier on, the Delta variant may not have happened. That's the key critique here. Your own Om Trivedi is actually writing a chapter on this for Indian ethics too. Certain modes of narration are more worthy than supposed hankering after objective theory, which is on a par with meta or grand narratives. Technoscience still believes it will fulfill the project of modernity. Meanwhile, it continues to subjugate nature, which includes also human subject, its body, languages, genetic codes, and animals as well. The subject, recall the person in Gandhi's vision, has all but been lost in the, as it were, manufactured process. So the subject is now assumed by facts. The manufacturing of facts, the known and named thing, in Lyotard's terms, is predicated on the success of performativity, a kind of performance which is calculated by profit, by productivity, by numbers. And today somebody wrote to me and said, oh, Sophia has gone down in rating by this standard. And I looked up and what was it? It was citation. That's all it was, not downloads. Sophia has one of the highest downloads. Citation. That's a scientific that people do in sciences a lot. That's not a measure for, but this is what it is. It's the performativity measured by some number, not what people learn from it, not whether they get wiser as a result of reading articles in Sophia, or critical or political for that matter, which is what I care for. So these underpin a basic presupposition of modernity, modernist education. Lyotard is against the legitimization of education through performativity. And so on this point, he is in agreement with Habermas, who, as we saw, questions the emphasis on assembly line efficiency and productivity as an end in itself, into which the individual in the capitalist and late industrial society is increasingly abducted, not educated. So, Habermas is critical of that, but he doesn't think that that's because enlightenment has been wrong totally all along. He said it's just gone into a little divergence and got stuck. We got to go further. It's a very Marxist kind of utopian idea that he has here. Fritzman explains this disquisition, which Leotard has with Luhmann's ideology more than with Habermas. According to Leotard, those who advocate the legitimization of education through performativity call for abandoning the principle, quote, that the acquisition of knowledge is indissoluble, cannot be dissolved from the training of minds or even of individuals, end quote. Indeed, Lyotard believes that the concept of education as Bildung, the German term, has been largely abandoned. The friends of performativity urge that pedagogy should impart only the knowledge and skills necessary to preserve and enhance the operational efficiency of society. For these persons, operational efficiency is determined by the result of cost-benefit or input-output analysis. It's what Silicon Valley thrives on. Society is conceived as an overarching, totalizing system that is constituted through the interaction of its subsystems. These subsystems include the economy, the family, the politics, and religion. The content of what is taught is determined by the technological requirements of the system. The educators are evaluated by how efficiently this content is conveyed. When the education is legitimated through performativity, Lyotard notes knowledge is not thought to have any intrinsic worth. Instead, knowledge is valued only as a commodity that can be sold. It no longer possesses use value, but only exchange value. So Amazon.com has the least educated people who are almost indistinguishable from the assembly line on which they work, the process, orders, package, delivery, and so on and so forth. They just have to read the labels and order. That's about all that's required of them. So that's the sort of, kind of education that Lyotard is warning us against. So this is one side of Lyotard's critique that argues that the goal of pedagogy is not to collect information or to arrive at universal consensus through discourse, as it is for Habermas, which really, in a way, I don't know what universal consensus would mean, but participating in a democratic system, being able to vote, and so on and so forth. But that's really not for him the true goal of education. But it rather marks the, quote, search for new ideas and concepts that disrupt and destabilizes previously existing consensus, which is the preserve of the arts studied through a language one is either born in or is trained in. Postmodern education is not simply a tool of the authorities. It refines our sensitivity to differences and reinforces our ability to tolerate the incommensurables. Its principles is not the expert's homology, but the inventor's paralogy. In other words, the différent, which is a French term, différent in many senses here. And it makes a difference, disruptively and perhaps even controversially. But even more poignantly, Lyotard's real concern, I believe, is in attacking the emancipatory pedagogy for its ascription to the notion of freestanding, autonomous subject, self-fashioned through free will and good intentions, the idea of individualism. That is, the notion of the individual. Instrumental actors as distinct from the person. See the difference between an individual and a person. A person is not something you can count. Right? A person is something you interact with, you empathize with, you absorb, you become one with, in union with. Whereas the individual, you don't. It's at a distance. It's almost a quasi-object. You count. you give, you move. So the individual, as distinct from the person, that the pre-modern and traditional societies had recognized, that is believed to command its own signifying chain of agency and may or may not opt to participate in the political, because economy is seen as an autonomous sphere separated from the public sphere. While so alienated, this is about the individual who can opt out, need not participate in the political, because everything is in this autonomous sphere. You don't talk about politics at dinner table, those kinds of things that individuals assume. And so alienated, he is readily abrogated. He has, or he will readily abrogate to himself rights and privileges and other free range commodities of a civil society. So rights become commodities. People claim rights, but they're actually in some ways commodities. The idea of the white right at the moment in the US is very different from the idea of civil rights, which, and native rights that the blacks claim. So, the whites are out on the streets saying our rights have been taken away and so forth. And, former President Trump tells them that, the government has taken away your working capabilities, your labor. So you must claim back that right. So go and riot in the Capitol, at the Parliament in, Washington, D.C., claim back your right. Rather than fixing the economy, it's become that kind of a talk of rights as a commodity, or the right to bear arms. So the arm is a commodity, and the right is attached to that. Leotard, of course, which is the same as the rights that Americans had over the slaves, the rights over a slave, a chattel, a property that over which you have a right. Person has disappeared. Leotard, of course, challenges the autonomy of the subject in this respect, for the subject is already foreclosed in the social power relations and the instrumentalist agenda of the technoculture. Or as post-colonial writers such as Ray Chu and Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak would have it, or the subjects further down, as it were, the subaltern letter, speaking subject belongs to an already well-defined structure of history and domination, right? So the subject now becomes part of domination. You see, there is slavery with a caste structure as well. To the incommensurability of the capitalist technoculture individual vis-a-vis the self-liberating postmodernism, add the third developing world's muted and often invisible subaltern subject. People I mentioned in the context of the COVID vaccinations and so forth too. There are islands that the French own in the Pacific. They're not even getting air conditioning units or masks in large numbers, or sanitation equipment, gear, and supplies to the hospitals. They don't even have enough hospitals. They never had a disaster of this kind. And yet, France expects them to pay X amount of taxes and get produce from those places. It's colonialism all over again. So, so where we are to locate this not yet subject, the different in the postmodern, say in Judith Butler's sense, in Lyotard's paralogy. This is precisely why I thought of reading Leotard against the grain of Gandhi, because, as it were, to be instructive here. Paralogy, as may be seen, is a much more ambitiously expansion in the areas of arts and aesthetics, and indeed also the classics, than Gandhi's Neo-Talib pedagogy had envisioned. So while one can criticize Leotard for certain things, what one cannot criticize is the emphasis that he puts, as I put it, in the expansion in the areas of arts and aesthetics. And I think that when you combine that to Gandhiji's project of Neo-Talib, you actually get Tagore. That's what you get. That's the interesting thing about this particular exploration that I made. I found amazing. So nevertheless, I wish to argue that Lyotard's own life and career goes a long way towards making this narrative possible, inasmuch as it exemplifies the goal he sets out to truly educated, or rather for the truly educated. And yet he appears to be restrained. He holds back from a full commitment to the political, in the sense of the intellectual responsibility to exercise the agency, not the falsely autonomously grounded free by choice actions in the economy of the market sides as a fully fledged activist ready to lay down, but rather as a fully fledged activist ready to lay down their life for the cause one is passionately committed to, as it were to throw a total satyagraha at the enemy or the adversary or the institution in the attempt to destabilize. Lyotard wasn't quite there. Gandhi once remarked, as of and rightly, the horrors of the Auschwitz, which is badly misquoted often, that if sufficient number of European and Jewish intellectuals had cared to arm themselves with the weapon, with the weapon of satyagraha and march into the Nazi camps, disarm the SS's troopers through sheer humility, even humor, and appeal to truth, Hitler might well have surrendered well before the Holocaust occurred. Something that Heidegger could have done had he swapped the right hemisphere of his otherwise genius brain and his genius brains with Hannah Arendt's and Karl Jasper's left hemisphere. Leotard was, of course, keen that postmodernity learns a bitter lesson from Heidegger's complicity in the self-destruction of modernity in the name of the Auschwitz. But the question remains, from as it were the third eye worldview position, was Leotard prepared to go all hog himself? And was then his paralogy and the supplemental pedagogy sufficiently saturated to achieve that end? As recounted in the introduction, Leotard up till 1969 was involved in the Algerian question and also supported the struggle against colonialism, which is interesting for a French intellectual. Derrida didn't do that, Foucault did. Hence his sympathies for the plight of the natives and subaltern in this context is unquestionable. Laudable also is the fact that he was engaged in his own practice as a lycée professor in Algeria. By engaged, one means an engaged teacher in the discourse of the public sphere. And in the asymmetry he underscores in the teacher-people relationship, which the institution of authority marks more symmetrically. And he undertook more direct and decisive political actions at an entire university. So education is political. However, in the 1970s and since, Leotard took the Socratic gadfly turn, a Voltairean Nietzsche writing and pushing for puissance, in other words, critical reflections, on the edges of modernity's near collapse through contradictions within its own discourse. The engagement henceforth is of the text, and the destabilization is focused on discourse, calling for the abandoning of the grand narratives of self-certainty of the sciences and so on. We might call it breaking the rules of the game, while however still located in, albeit uneasily, but not entirely outside of, the text in the professor's privileged chair. Hence, what seemed lacking is a complete commitment to any sort of program and or enlisting of religious interest in the political sphere, even for its sweetest jouissance, pleasure. So concluding remarks of this particular part of the lecture. In conclusion, it would seem that Gandhi's concerns with the extent of the destruction that colonialism and its agency capitalism was causing would far outweigh in the history of the West that was being made, would rather rapidly bring down the towers of modernity. And so his fight had to be taken, and intellectual could not be shortchanged. So Gandhi knew that the way to end sort of India's plight and the plight of colonialism, which many countries and many people without countries, like the African Americans in America, or Jews in Europe, or Palestinians in the Middle East under the Turkish Empire, suffered. All right, So this fight had to be taken, an intellectual fight, and taken to the streets as well. The goal of education produce such destabilizing persons who at the same time are loyal to a community to which they devote their life. The two seemingly antinomian kinds of discourse are not incommensurable. A postmodernist who combines and foreshadows elements of the postmodern and postcolonial as well. The dual post here registers Gandhi's recognition that while the whole rational heritage of scientism, modernity, progress, as championed and practiced by the West, has achieved a great deal during the last 4 centuries, this legacy has now reached its logical limits of utility and relevance. Progress itself is being questioned and is becoming questionable as a desired goal. It has crossed the threshold of the excess, the excessive. In ancient Sanskrit, axiom enjoins ati sarvatra varjayat. Excess should be shunned everywhere. In more prosaic terms, globalization and liberalization through the increasingly invasive presence of multinational corporations has ravaged India's textile industry, not to mention Gandhi's own crafted khadi. So, nobody is spinning clothes on this. It's gone. As a symbol, a vast big symbol outside the Nehru Indira Gandhi, rather Indira Gandhi Nehru International Airport, but it's totally meaningless. I mean, it's pointless to have a charkha made that large, which has no function whatsoever, is what Ashit Nandi told me. In more prosaic terms, globalization, liberalization through the increasing invasive presence of multinational corporations has ravaged India's textile industry, but also the agriculture and ecological self-sufficiency. The farmers' strikes that are going on right there in Delhi is a response to what's going on. Continuation in some ways of the colonial project, or the continuation of the internal colonialism project, neo-colonial project. There are many ways of looking at colonialism, not just from outside, but from inside as well. That's what was happening to the African Americans in America and other European countries, in Australia with the Australian Aborigines experiences. And of course, that's what Baba Ambedkar said about what's happening to the Dalits under the double yoke of colonialism, or prior to that, Brahmanism, and combined then with colonialism, is doubly suppressive. Similarly for women as well. So, as a recent trade union leader, Babu Matthew, observes, modernity might have freed people from shackles, but it is now going to reinforce capitalism, or corporatism, or corporate capitalism, if you like. In other words, it's not the capitalism of the small stores, but of reliances, of Amazon.com, Google, and so forth. You can release bonded laborers, but they're going to be reintegrated into the worst form of bondage. Unionism means nothing. In America, the unionization is almost abolished, and it's now created by corporations themselves, which is really just subscription membership group type of thing. Not somewhere where voices are expressed. Modernity is traveling so fast, it is going to tear societies apart. I'm still quoting Babu Matthew. We have an opportunity to develop a new critique of modernity, and it differs to the Gandhian model and to people's informed initiatives and actions. Habermas, for his part, is equally critical of the capitalist society enamored of the techne of science in its performativity culture, the efficiency and economy of skills that produces more for the sake of producing and consuming for the sake of consuming. That's what televisions tell you. This product is good. Today you buy Colgate. Tomorrow you buy Palmolive Colgate. The next day you buy Ipana Colgate. And people have probably forgotten the name Ipana in India. Anyway, but nobody goes in, buys Binaka toothpaste. And it's forgotten because it was made by a small little a plant in West Bengal. People didn't even know where the word Binaka came from. It actually came from the colonies in the Pacific, which means good. Oh, how are you? Binaka. Oh, how are you? I'm Binaka. I'm good. Anyway, but he believes, this is Habermas again, the universal project of modernity is just incomplete within the more radical planks of the Enlightenment itself. So that's why he's sort of seen to be neo-Kantian, maybe he combines Marx and Kant sort of kind of together, which are all Enlightenment figures as far as people like Max Weber or M.M. Roy or people outside of Britain and the German conglomerate of concern. Lyotard too rejects performativity and believes modernity has reached its zenith point of excesses, which is beginning to undermine the Enlightenment's rational choice paradigm from within. He holds education or its failure in the schools of modernity as much more responsible for continuing the malaise. And this is his argument also with Lyotard, that unless there is a radical shift in pedagogy towards paralogy, defined as the ongoing creation of meaning derived from exercising basic capabilities in the arts, aesthetics, critical thinking, and language, there is little hope of redeeming even the best of traditional Western legacy, let alone for the rest of the globe. Lyotard, however, is not as much interested in a return or a retrieval of the pre-modern or the pre-Europeanization of the world, for that would only perpetuate the old logocentrism. So, he's critical of Habermas. He thinks that the pedagogy is not radical enough. It's only radical if it goes towards paralogy, as he defines it. Where the basic capabilities, Leotard is talking about capabilities before Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum took it from Jain virtue ethics. But apart from his activism in Algiers, which was against French colonialism, Lyotard seems to show very little awareness of the plight, predicament, and poverty of the developing world, in short, of the post-colonial condition. So he writes on postmodern condition, but not the post-colonial condition. Thus, if the driving force of science and technology is economics or the market, poverty will not be addressed. Yet it is his discourse that has tremendous possibilities, that I must confess, and indeed has provided a refreshing basis for a critique of modernity to many post-structuralist, post-colonial, and feminist writers from India and Asia at large, supplementing the Frankfurt School, Foucault, Derrida, Kristeva et al. Now, I found no reference to Gandhi in his entire work. This is in Leotard. I think there might be some reference in Habermas. I think I remember once coming across it, but not in Leotard. Although I suspect the recurrent reference to Avatar might have a distant signified echo in the international presence of Gandhi. For surely in Algiers, he would have known it was Gandhi who threw the first stones at Western colonialism. How could they not? How could anybody not know that? How could even Heidegger pretend not to know that? In any case, it appears to me at the end of the day that Lyotard is poised somewhere in the middle between Gandhi and Habermas and ends up with Tagore, for the reasons I've argued in the third part of the chapter. He remains perhaps an exemplary Amsa avatar, a miniature avatar, but certainly a Mahabodhisattva or a megalopsychia, as Aristotle sense of the proven great soul. That is exactly the kind of postmodernism, the kind of postmodern intellectual paralogy and the particular pedagogy he builds on, this disturbing discourse that is intended to yield this particular end that he has in mind. And herein lies the seeds for a synthesis of Gandhian pedagogy, of productive education, and Lyotard's intellectual paralogy. Interestingly enough, sprouts more or less in the aesthetically nuanced educational practice of Gandhi's friend, Rabindranath Tagore in West Bengal. It's a kind of a culmination. So space does not permit us, or time, to explore this epic convergence here. Thankfully, a recent study aptly succeeded in capturing the gist of Tagore's unique achievement in this area, as Ghost 2017, if you like reference, I could give you them, for which he expressed gratitude in part to Gandhi's inspiring and exemplary life. So, Gandhi would visit Shanti Niketan and they would have some discussions, and Gandhi was made the key guest for a convocation. I don't know what we call it, commencement here, but the graduation ceremony. In fact, it was Tagore who bestowed, of course, as we know, the title of Gandhi on the Mahatma rather, onto the unmistakable avataric presence of the 20th century. So this is the end of this part of the lecture.